What happens when America's most passionate progressive politician meets late-night television's sharpest wit, and the conversation takes a turn that nobody saw coming? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive encounter that had Senator Bernie Sanders walking off Stephen Colbert's set in the middle of a live taping, leaving the audience stunned and the host scrambling to fill dead air. This isn't your typical political interview gone wrong. This is the story of how a routine promotional appearance for Sanders' latest book became a battleground of ideologies, where personal attacks replaced policy discussions, and where the line between entertainment and journalism was crossed in the most uncomfortable way possible. The tension was building from the moment Sanders sat down. But what started as playful banter quickly escalated into something much more serious. Before we get into the full breakdown of this incredible confrontation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me what you think really motivated Colbert's aggressive approach that night. Was it genuine political disagreement, or something more calculated for ratings? Now let's dive into exactly how this political powder keg exploded on live television. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had always been known for its political commentary, but nothing could have prepared the studio audience for what they were about to witness. Senator Bernie Sanders walked onto the familiar set with his characteristic confident stride, waving to the enthusiastic crowd who had clearly come expecting their usual dose of progressive politics. Mixed with Colbert's trademark humor, the applause was thunderous, lasting nearly 30 seconds as Sanders made his way to the guest chair, his familiar white hair catching the studio lights. Colbert's opening was standard fare, the kind of warm welcome that had become his signature with political guests. He congratulated Sanders on his latest book, made a few light jokes about his mittens from the presidential inauguration, and seemed to settle into what everyone expected would be another friendly interview with a like-minded political figure. Sanders responded with his usual gravelly charm, chuckling at the appropriate moments and launching into his well-rehearsed talking points about economic inequality and corporate greed. But something was different about Colbert that night. Those who knew his interview style well might have noticed the slight edge in his voice, the way his questions seemed to carry just a bit more bite than usual, where he typically would have nodded along with Sanders' familiar refrains about the billionaire class. Instead, he began to push back with unexpected vigor. The first sign of trouble came when Sanders was discussing his proposal for a wealth tax, explaining how it would fund universal health care and education programs. Colbert interrupted him mid-sentence, something that rarely happened with friendly guests. His tone shifted noticeably as he said, "Senator, with all due respect, haven't we heard this exact same speech from you for the past 6 years? Don't you think the American people deserve something new, something that actually acknowledges political reality instead of these impossible pipe dreams?" The studio fell silent. This wasn't the supportive platform Sanders had clearly expected. Sanders, caught off guard, but trying to maintain his composure, attempted to respond with his usual passionate defense of progressive policies. He started to explain how countries like Denmark and Sweden had successfully implemented similar programs, but Colbert cut him off again. "Oh, here we go with the Scandinavian comparisons again. Senator, you're not running for president of Norway? You're supposedly representing Vermont, but it seems like you spend more time writing books and giving speeches than actually legislating." The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Sanders' jaw tightened, and his hands, which had been gesturing animatedly moments before, now gripped the arms of his chair. The audience, unsure how to react, remained uncomfortably quiet. This was clearly not the direction anyone had expected the interview to take. Colbert, seemingly energized by the uncomfortable atmosphere he had created, leaned forward and continued his assault. "Let's talk about your track record, Bernie. In your decades in Congress, what major legislation bears your name? What significant bills have you actually gotten passed? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your biggest accomplishment is convincing young people to donate their coffee money to campaigns that go nowhere." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sanders' face was beginning to redden with barely contained anger. Sanders tried to regain control of the narrative, citing his work on Veterans Affairs and his role in expanding community health centers, but Colbert wasn't having it. "Those are nice talking points, Senator, but let's be honest about what you really are. You're not a legislator, you're a performance artist. You've built a brand around being angry about inequality while becoming quite wealthy yourself, selling that anger to people who can't afford to be as privileged as you are. The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Sanders sat back in his chair, his eyes flashing with indignation. This had gone far beyond typical late-night television sparring. Colbert had essentially accused him of being a hypocrite and a fraud on national television. The audience began to murmur uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply personal. Sanders leaned forward, his voice rising with the passion that had made him a political icon. But there was something different about his energy now, something more defensive and raw. "Stephen, I have to say I'm surprised by this line of questioning. I came here to talk about the issues that matter to working families, about the crisis of inequality that's tearing this country apart. And instead, you're launching personal attacks that sound like they came straight from a Republican opposition research file." The senator's response seemed to only fuel Colbert's aggressive approach. The host's eyes gleamed with what could only be described as predatory satisfaction, as he sensed he had struck a nerve. "Personal attacks. Senator, these are legitimate. Questions about your effectiveness and your authenticity. You've been in Washington for 30 years, and the problems you campaign on have only gotten worse. Maybe it's time to ask whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem." Colbert's tone had shifted from playful mockery to something much more serious and cutting. He continued without giving Sanders a chance to respond. "You know what I find interesting? You rail against the establishment, but you've been part of that establishment longer than most of the people you criticize. You attack millionaires and billionaires, but you own multiple homes and have made millions from your books. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Sanders' face was now visibly flushed, his trademark finger-wagging beginning to emerge as he tried to defend himself. "Listen, Stephen, I think you're being fundamentally unfair here. Yes, I've been successful with my books, but that doesn't change the fact that we have a system that works for the wealthy and powerful at the expense of everyone else. The fact that I've been able to achieve some financial security doesn't invalidate the message." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Doesn't it, though? I mean, you're sitting here in your expensive suit, having flown here probably in first class, staying in a nice hotel, and you're going to lecture America about economic inequality? It's like a millionaire telling people they can't afford to eat cake while eating cake himself." The audience was now clearly uncomfortable, with some people shifting in their seats and others looking around as if hoping someone would intervene. This had gone far beyond the bounds of normal political discourse, even for a show known for its political edge. Sanders attempted to redirect the conversation back to policy, but Colbert seemed determined to make this personal. "And let's talk about your supporters," Colbert continued, his voice taking on an even more condescending tone. "You've cultivated this army of young idealists who think you're going to single-handedly transform America. But what have you actually delivered? For them, they donated their rent money to your campaigns, they phone-banked for you, they believed in your revolution, and what did they get? Nothing but empty promises and another book deal for Bernie Sanders." Sanders was now gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. His voice, when he spoke, was strained with the effort of maintaining his composure. "Stephen, I have to say that this is not what I expected when I agreed to come on your show. I thought we were going to have a substantive discussion about the challenges facing working families, about climate change, about healthcare. Instead, you seem more interested in character assassination." Colbert leaned back in his chair with a smirk that was becoming increasingly unpleasant. "Character assassination? Senator, I'm asking you to defend your record. If that feels like character assassination, maybe that says something about your record. You've made a career out of being the angry voice of the people, but what have you actually accomplished for those people?" The host's questioning had taken on an almost prosecutorial tone, and it was clear that this was no longer an interview but an interrogation. "Let me ask you this, Bernie. Do you ever feel guilty about the donations you've received from people who could barely afford them? College students eating ramen noodles so they could send you $27? Retirees on fixed incomes giving you their Social Security money? How do you sleep at night, knowing that your political theater has enriched you while accomplishing nothing for them?" Sanders finally exploded, his voice rising to a level that made several audience members jump. "Now you've gone too far, Stephen. You're questioning my integrity, my commitment to the working class, And frankly, you're doing it in a way that's completely inappropriate and unprofessional. And I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who makes millions entertaining the elite. The accusation that Colbert entertained the elite, rather than challenging power structures, seemed to hit a nerve. The host's demeanor shifted again, becoming even more aggressive. "Oh, so now I'm the elite? That's rich, coming from someone who's been in Congress longer than some of your supporters have been alive. You want to talk about entertainment? What do you call those rallies where you repeat the same stump speech word for word? What do you call those fundraising emails that promise revolution but deliver nothing but requests for more money?" Sanders stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the now silent studio. "I'm not going to continue this ambush disguised as an interview. You're more interested in scoring cheap points and creating conflict for your ratings." Colbert, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far but unable to stop himself, pressed on with his attack. "Running away, Senator? Is this how you handle tough questions? This is exactly the problem with your approach to politics. All passion and no substance. All rhetoric and no results." The words seemed to hang in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Sanders paused at the edge of the stage area, his body language conveying a mix of fury and disappointment. The audience held its collective breath, unsure whether he would return to his seat or continue his exit. For a moment, it seemed like he might come back and continue the fight, but then his shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of the encounter had finally settled on him. "You know what, Stephen?" Sanders said, his voice now carrying a tone of profound sadness rather than anger. "I came here thinking I was going to talk to someone who understood the struggle of working families, someone who got it. Instead, I find myself being attacked by someone who seems to have forgotten where he came from. This isn't journalism, this isn't entertainment, this is just cruelty." Colbert, perhaps sensing that the mood in the room had shifted decisively against him, made one final attempt to justify his approach. "Senator, I'm just asking the questions that your supporters deserve to have answered. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in public life." But his words lacked the conviction they had carried earlier, and there was something almost desperate in his tone now. Sanders shook his head slowly, looking not at Colbert but at the audience, many of whom were now clearly sympathetic to his. "What I haven't faced is this kind of personal attack, masquerading as legitimate questioning. The American people deserve better than this, and frankly, so do I." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point, and Sanders began walking toward the exit, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the chaos that had just unfolded. But Colbert, seemingly unable to let his guest leave without having the last word, called out across the stage in a voice that carried clearly through the dead silent studio. "Senator Sanders, you can't just walk away every time someone challenges your narrative. This is exactly what's wrong with your brand of politics. You demand ideological purity from everyone else, but you can't handle having your own contradictions." Pointed out, the words were delivered with a smugness that made several audience members audibly gasp, and the sound seemed to freeze Sanders in his tracks. Sanders turned around slowly, and for a moment it looked like he might return to continue the confrontation. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but there was something else there too, a deep disappointment that seemed to cut deeper than any anger could. "My brand of politics," he repeated, his voice now carrying a quiet intensity that was somehow more powerful than his earlier shouting. "Stephen, my brand of politics is fighting for people who work 2 jobs and still can't pay rent. My brand of politics is standing up to pharmaceutical companies that charge diabetics $300 for insulin that costs $3 to make." Colbert, perhaps realizing that he was losing the moral high ground, but unable to back down now, pressed forward with his attack. "And yet here you are, unable to answer basic questions about your own effectiveness. You've been giving the same speeches about the same problems for decades, but those problems have only gotten worse. At what point do you take responsibility for your own failures instead of just blaming the system?" The accusation seemed to strike at the very core of Sanders' political identity, and his response came with a passion that filled the entire studio. "Failures. You want to talk about failures? The failure is a media system that's more interested in creating conflict than covering the real issues. The failure is hosts who would rather attack progressives than challenge the corporate interests that are destroying this country. The failure is treating politics like a sport instead of recognizing that people's lives are at stake. Saunders' words seemed to resonate with much of the audience, who began to murmur their agreement, but Colbert appeared determined to maintain his aggressive stance. Oh, so now it's the media's fault. It's everyone's fault except Bernie Sanders. Senator, you've had 3 decades to prove that your approach works. And what do we have to show for it? The same inequality, the same corporate power, the same broken system you started complaining about when you first got to Washington. The host's relentless attack seemed to drain something from Sanders, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? Tonight, instead of talking about the fact that people are rationing their medication because they can't afford it, we're having this pointless argument. Instead of discussing how we can create good-paying jobs or address the climate crisis, you've turned this into a personal attack that serves no one except your ratings. Colbert leaned forward in his chair, his expression showing no signs of backing down. Maybe that's because the personal stuff matters, Senator. Maybe your supporters deserve to know whether the person they're following actually has what it takes to deliver on his promises, or whether he's just really good at making them feel angry about things he can't change. The words hit Sanders like a physical blow, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, he seemed genuinely stunned. He stood there for a moment, processing what had just been said, and when he finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper but somehow carried more power than all his earlier shouting. Stephen, I have spent my entire career fighting for people who don't have lobbyists, people who don't have super PACs, people who don't have a voice in this system. And tonight, you've chosen to use your platform not to amplify those voices, but to silence the one person who's been fighting for them in the Senate. The studio was now completely silent, except for the humming of the television equipment. Even Colbert seemed momentarily at a loss for words, perhaps finally recognizing the magnitude of what he had done. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down with what would prove to be his final attack of the evening, fighting for them. You've been fighting for yourself. You've built a political brand around being the outsider, the rebel, but you're as much a part of the Washington establishment as anyone else. The only difference is that you've monetized your anger better than most politicians monetize their success. The accusation was delivered with such cold calculation that several audience members actually booed. A sound that seemed to surprise Colbert. Sanders looked at the host for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his words carried a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. I came here tonight to talk about the issues that matter to working families across this country. Instead, I've been subjected to a character assassination that would make Fox News proud. I won't be part of this anymore. With that, Sanders turned and walked off the stage, his exit accompanied by what started as scattered applause from the audience, but quickly grew into sustained clapping that seemed to express their disapproval of what they had just witnessed. Colbert sat alone at his desk, the camera still rolling, clearly unprepared for how to handle the situation he had created. As Sanders disappeared behind the curtain, Colbert attempted to regain control of his show, but his words seemed hollow and defensive. Well, there you have it, folks. Senator Bernie Sanders, unable to handle tough questions about his record. But the joke fell flat, and the studio audience remained largely silent, their mood having shifted decisively against the host. The remainder of the show was awkward and disjointed. With Colbert clearly rattled by what had transpired, he attempted to continue with his planned segments, but the energy in the room had been completely destroyed by the confrontation. Staff members could be seen moving nervously in the background, and several audience members actually got up and left during the commercial breaks. What made the entire incident even more remarkable was how completely it contradicted everything. Viewers thought they knew about both men. Sanders, known for his passionate speeches and willingness to engage in political combat, had maintained remarkable dignity even as he was being attacked. Colbert, usually the champion of progressive causes and the scourge of conservative politicians, had instead chosen to tear down one of the most prominent voices for the very causes he claimed to support. The confrontation revealed something troubling about the nature of modern media and political discourse. Rather than using his platform to explore important policy questions or challenge actual wrongdoing, Colbert had chosen to create conflict for its own sake, treating a serious public servant like entertainment fodder to be consumed and discarded. For ratings, In the end, Sanders' decision to walk off represented more than just a rejection of one hostile interview. It was a statement about the kind of political discourse that serves the public interest versus the kind that serves only the interests of those who profit from division and conflict. His exit from that stage was dignified, principled, and ultimately more powerful than any comeback or witty retort could have been. So, what do you think drove Stephen Colbert to take such an inexplicably hostile approach with a guest who should have been a natural ally? Was this a calculated move to generate controversy and boost ratings, or was there something deeper going on behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more breakdowns of the moments when political theater gets all too real.